Good evening, friend. I invite you to settle down, let your mind rest, and allow me to guide you into a world long past a world of the Vikings, where even death was not a quiet affair. You may have heard of Viking funerals before, perhaps imagined a ship set aflame, drifting peacefully into the sea. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But history, as always, prefers to surprise us. The truth of these rituals was far stranger, far less romantic, and at times unsettling. Still, there is something oddly soothing in knowing how people of the past faced the final journey. With fire, with song, with ritual, they sought to honor the dead and prepare them for whatever awaited beyond. And while some of these customs might chill us today, they were, for the Vikings, a bridge between this life and the next, so close. Your eyes, if you wish, let the images form gently in your imagination, and drift with me into the mist of history where ships, flames, and whispered prayers mark the path of the departed. When we think of Vikings, our minds often drift to long ships cutting through icy waters, warriors shouting with wild abandon, and of course, the famous Viking funeral, a grand ship set ablaze, sliding into the horizon as the flames consume it. Hollywood loves this image. It's beautiful, it's cinematic, and it's wonderfully inaccurate. The reality of Viking funerals is far more complex and far less glamorous. For one thing, most Vikings were not sent off in flaming ships. In fact, most didn't have ships at all. Ships were expensive, labor-intensive, and not something you could simply set on fire unless you were so wealthy that losing one didn't matter. Imagine burning a luxury yacht today, just because your uncle passed away. Romantic? Maybe. Practical? Absolutely not. Instead, many Viking burials involved simple graves, sometimes mounds of earth, sometimes a pit with personal belongings placed carefully beside the deceased. And while the wealthy might indeed be buried with a ship, or at least in a boat-shaped grave, this was the exception, not the rule. Yet, myths have a way of outshining facts, don't they? Even the idea of sending the dead out to sea is more fantasy than fact. Archaeological evidence suggests that most Viking burials happened on land. The ship was a powerful symbol, a vessel to carry the soul into the next world, across unseen waters. But it didn't always need to be literal. Carved stones, boat-shaped graves, or simply the suggestion of a journey could serve the same symbolic purpose. And here's a curious truth. Sometimes bodies weren't even burned. Cremation was one option, burial another. The choice depended on local customs, beliefs, and even simple practicality. Firewood, for example, was not infinite in the north. If your village needed timber for warmth and survival, setting up a grand pyre might not be the wisest use of resources. After all, even Vikings had to be practical. But still, the imagery of fire was powerful. Flames rising into the cold Nordic sky were seen as a bridge between the worlds, carrying smoke and perhaps the spirit upward, toward the gods. It was a spectacle of transformation, where flesh became ash, and ash returned to the earth. If this all sounds a little different from the movie version, that's because it was, and yet history is often more fascinating when we peel away the myths. The real Viking funerals were not just about honoring the dead, they were about community, belief, and sometimes unsettling displays of loyalty and fear. And before we continue deeper into this story, let me pause and remind you, if you're enjoying this journey through the quieter, stranger side of history, feel free to like this video, subscribe for more midnight tales, and leave a thought in the comments. After all, your support helps keep these stories alive, just without the smoke and human sacrifice. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. The Vikings, standing by the grave or pyre, saying farewell, not with silence, but with ritual. If you could travel back to a Viking funeral, You might be surprised by how much of it felt like theater. Imagine a gathering of villagers, standing around the body of a fallen warrior or a chieftain. The air would be heavy with the smell of wood smoke, perhaps mixed with herbs, perhaps not. There might be chanting, or the rhythmic beat of drums, creating an atmosphere at once somber and strangely celebratory. After all, this was not just about mourning, it was about guiding the deceased on their final voyage. And voyages, in Viking culture, mattered a great deal. A Viking life was defined by movement, crossing seas, raiding shores, trading in distant markets. So, when death came, it was only natural that their burial reflected this eternal journey. The boat, whether real or symbolic, was the key motif. To place someone in a boat was to say, "Here begins your next expedition." But let's not pretend everyone received this treatment. If you were a common fisherman, chances are your funeral was a modest one. Maybe a shallow grave, maybe a few tools, or a simple offering of food placed beside you. Your family might whisper prayers to Odin or Freya, hoping you'd find safe passage. The great spectacles, the ships, the sacrifices, the burning pyres, often reserved for those of higher status. Viking funerals, in other words, were also a matter of social class. The bigger the show, the more important you had been. This leads us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking funerals: the mixture of sacred duty and social performance. People weren't just honoring the dead, they were also sending a message to the living. A lavish funeral told everyone, this man was powerful, this family is strong, this community knows how to honor its own. It was, in a way, propaganda delivered through fire and ritual rather than speeches. We know this not just from sagas and legends, but from eyewitness accounts. The Arab diplomat, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who traveled to the lands of the Rus often, connected with Viking traders, described in shocking detail what he saw at one such funeral in the 10th century. His account would later become one of the most vivid windows into the Viking world of death. Spoiler, it was not peaceful. It was raw, frightening, and unforgettable. But we'll return to that story soon. Don't worry, I won't leave you hanging out for now. Let's think about the symbolism of fire. To the Vikings, fire was not destruction, it was transformation. It changed the body, yes, but it also released the spirit. And so, when they burned a body, they weren't just disposing of it, they were sending it off, purifying it, preparing it for the gods. Some modern cremations feel sterile by comparison, reduced to machinery and efficiency. A Viking funeral pyre, on the other hand, was loud, messy, and communal. People stood together, watching the flames rise, as if they could see the soul being lifted into the heavens. There is something oddly comforting in this, isn't there? The idea that death was not an end, but a passage, even if it involved some terrifying rituals. The heart of it was a belief in continuity, that life was a journey, and death was just the next leg of the voyage. Of course, when you're listening to this in bed, drifting off, you don't have to picture the screaming sacrifices or the smell of burning wood too vividly. Let the fire crackle softly in your imagination. Let the longship drift quietly in your mind, and perhaps you'll understand why these funerals carried such weight for the Viking people. And if you've stayed with me so far into the tale, this might be a good moment to gently tap the like button, subscribe for more soothing but strange history, and maybe even share a thought in the comments. After all, just as the Vikings believed in sending things forward, your support helps this little channel sail further to dot. Now, with the fire still glowing in your imagination, let us step closer to the most unsettling part of all. What happened when the funeral required more than wood, more than wealth, more than ritual? What happened when it required blood? Now, as the firelight flickered against the dark sky, the funeral could take an even darker turn, because in some Viking traditions, The dead were not expected to journey alone. Companions, sometimes animals, sometimes humans, were chosen to follow the deceased into the afterlife. This, dear listener, is where the soothing tones of history grow a little unsettling. The most famous account, again, comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, whose writings describe the funeral of a Viking chieftain. He witnessed not only the building of a grand pyre and the placement of treasures into the ship, but also the preparation of a slave girl who volunteered or perhaps was persuaded to accompany her. Master in death, her final days were filled with ritual. She was cared for, dressed in fine clothes, given intoxicating drinks, and paraded around the camp while people whispered to her, as if guiding her spirit toward acceptance. On the final day, she was led onto the ship. There, ritual songs were sung, drums beat steadily, and as the pyre was set alight, she was killed so that she might join her master in the next life. It is a grim story, one that lingers long after you hear it, but it also tells us something profound about the Viking worldview. To them, loyalty extended beyond life. Death was not simply an ending, but a binding contract, sealed by ritual, flame, and sacrifice. Of course, not every Viking funeral was so dramatic. Most burials did not involve human sacrifice, but the fact that it happened, at all recorded by witnesses, and confirmed by us that their culture existed in a space, both deeply spiritual and deeply violent. They believed the afterlife was real enough to send people along as travel companions. Imagine that. Booking a one-way trip to Valhalla and dragging a few friends along whether they wanted to come or not. Dark, yes, but it does say something about how seriously they took their mythology now. Before you get too lost in these chilling images, let's step back and soften the tone. The point of recounting this is not to terrify you, but to show how life, death, and belief intertwined in ways that might seem strange to us today. Where we might light a candle in memory of someone, the Vikings lit entire ships on fire. Where we might gather in quiet reflection, they staged a performance of myth and ritual. Both acts, in their own ways, speak to the same desire, to honor, to remember, and to ensure that the departed are not alone. And perhaps there is comfort in that. Even if the methods were brutal, the meaning was deeply human. To send someone into the unknown, not empty-handed, not forgotten, but surrounded by the symbols of their life and community, that is something we can understand, even if we would not repeat their methods. So, as you lie here listening, let the harsher edges of the story fade into mist. Picture instead the solemn gathering, the songs rising in the night, the flames carrying a soul into the sky. In its own way, it was beautiful, and in its own way, it reminds us that across cultures and centuries, humans have always sought to make death meaningful. And if you found this glimpse into Viking rituals, both strange and strangely calming, this would be a fine time to gently press like, subscribe, to join me on future midnight journeys, and leave a thought in the comments. After all, history is not just about the past, it's about the way we share it in the present. With that, we close the first chapter of our tale. The myths and realities of Viking funerals are now clearer, though still cloaked in smoke and mystery. And in our next chapter, we'll dive deeper into the ships, the symbols, and the fire that made these rituals unforgettable. When it comes to Viking funerals, the most enduring image is the ship. Whether it floated on water, burned on a pyre, or was buried beneath the earth, the ship was at the heart of their rituals. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just transportation, it was life itself. It carried them to distant lands, brought wealth through trade, and bore warriors into battle. So naturally, it was imagined as the perfect vessel to carry one into the afterlife. Archaeologists have uncovered several extraordinary ship burials, most famously the Oseberg and Gokstad ships in Norway. These vessels weren't tiny boats either. They were grand, beautifully crafted, with curved prows that seemed to slice through both sea and imagination. And yet these ships were not set aflame and pushed out to sea as Hollywood would have us believe. Instead, they were carefully buried in the ground, surrounded by goods, animals, and sometimes even servants. A ship beneath a mound of earth sailing, not across water, but through soil, into eternity. It may sound less cinematic, but in many ways, it is more fascinating. The ground itself became an ocean, the mound a wave, the ship forever journeying toward the horizon of the afterlife. This blend of practicality and symbolism was typical of Viking thought. They didn't need the literal act to carry the meaning. The idea of a journey was powerful enough. Fire, too, played a central role. Fire consumed, but it also transformed. To cremate a body was to release it, to set the soul free. And as the smoke rose, it was as though the deceased themselves were rising toward Asgard, or perhaps to Valhalla, where endless feasts and battles awaited. If you've ever sat by a fire on a cold night, watching sparks drift into the sky, you can imagine how moving such a scene must have been for the Vikings. But not everyone received the fire or the ship. The wealthy and powerful had access to these rituals. The rest often had simpler burials. This disparity reminds us that funerals weren't just about religion, they were about status. A grand send-off proclaimed wealth, lineage, and power. A modest grave said, "Here lies someone ordinary." In this sense, funerals were as much about the living as about the dead. Still, even the humblest funeral carried symbols. Perhaps a favorite tool, a small offering of food, or a carved charm. These tokens spoke of love and remembrance, even if they lacked the grandeur of a ship. In a way, they remind us that meaning doesn't always need spectacle. A simple act, performed with belief, can carry as much weight as the largest pyre, of course. For the Vikings, the bigger the display, the better the story. And they loved stories. Saga after saga paints the funeral as a grand stage, where the dead were honored, not in silence, but with action. It was about showing the gods and your neighbors that you belonged to something larger than life itself. And speaking of belonging, if you found yourself gently carried along by these images of ships and fire, this would be a wonderful moment to like the video, subscribe for more soothing stories, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Think of it as placing a small symbolic token beside this tale, helping it sail a little farther into the night. Now, let us look more closely at what exactly went into these funerals. The objects, the wealth, the curious things placed alongside the dead, and why they mattered so very much. If you were to peek inside a Viking grave, you might be struck by the sheer variety of objects carefully placed with the body. These were not random trinkets thrown together at the last minute. They were chosen with intention, each carrying meaning for the journey ahead. For the wealthy, the grave might resemble a small treasure chest. Weapons, swords, axes, spears were often laid beside warriors, sometimes deliberately bent or broken. To us, that might seem wasteful. Why ruin a perfectly good sword? But to the Vikings, this act released the weapon's spirit, ensuring it could follow its master into the next life. In other words, you didn't want to show up in Valhalla with a rusty old blade. Better to arrive with a properly activated one. Animals, too, were common companions in burial. Horses especially were valued, symbolizing mobility and strength, and believed to help carry the soul across the unseen terrain of death. In some burials, entire teams of horses were sacrificed, a clear sign of status. Dogs might also be included, ever loyal, ready to guard their owner in the afterlife. One can only hope they wagged their tails as cheerfully in death as in life. But it wasn't all war and sacrifice. Everyday objects were often found as well: tools, cooking pots, even combs. Yes, combs. The Vikings, despite their fierce reputation, cared quite a lot about grooming. To be buried with a comb suggests that personal appearance mattered even beyond the grave. Imagine arriving at Odin's hall, with your hair in a tangle, clearly not acceptable. For women, grave goods might include brooches, beads, weaving tools, or household objects reflecting both their social role and their personal wealth. Some burials were astonishingly rich. The Oseberg ship, for example, contained 2 women surrounded by an abundance of goods, including carved wooden sledges, tapestries, and even a cart. Whoever they were clearly people of influence, carried into eternity with enough possessions to start their own afterlife household. Yet not all graves were so lavish. Many were simple, modest affairs. A body, a few small tokens, and a final resting place marked by stones or a mound. And in that simplicity lies a truth. Most Vikings did not live as legends. They were farmers, traders, workers, ordinary people. Their funerals reflected this, quiet but no less meaningful to those who loved them. This contrast between rich and poor. Funerals shows us that Viking society was as divided as any other. A grand burial was a statement. This family is powerful. This lineage matters. The modest one said, "We did what we could with what we had." Death, in other words, was the great equalizer, except when it wasn't. And yet, whether rich or poor, the symbolism remained. Every grave, no matter how small, carried the idea of a journey. Every item placed beside the dead spoke to love, remembrance, and the hope that death was not the end. There is a quiet comfort in that thought, that across centuries and cultures, people have always wanted the same thing, to send their loved ones forward with care. And speaking of sending things forward, if you're still listening, gently drifting with these images of ships and treasures, perhaps this is a good time to like the video, subscribe for more stories of the past, and leave a thought in the comments. It doesn't need to be grand like the Vikings. Even a simple token carries meaning now. Let us move toward the heart of fire itself, the act of cremation, the towering pyres, and the belief that flame could transform a mortal body into something eternal. Picture, if you will, the heart of a Viking cremation, a towering pyre, stacked carefully with wood, branches, and sometimes fragrant herbs. At its center lay the body of the deceased, surrounded by treasures and offerings. As the flames were lit, the crackling grew louder, sparks leapt upward, and the crowd stood in silence, or perhaps sang chants to accompany the fire's roar. To the Vikings, this was not mere disposal. Fire was sacred, alive, and transformative. It consumed flesh and bone, yes, but it also freed the soul. Watching smoke rise into the endless northern sky, they imagined the spirit carried upward, drifting beyond sight, toward the gods. If you've ever sat beside a fire on a winter's night, staring into the flames, you'll know the strange comfort it can bring. The Vikings felt that too, but magnified 100-fold, because for them, the fire was not just warmth, it was passage. The body burned, but the spirit sailed on. Of course, not everyone had a pyre. Cremation required wood, and wood was a precious commodity in the north. Cutting down trees for a funeral meant choosing not to use that timber for homes, ships, or warmth. So, cremation was often reserved for those of higher rank, or in times and places where resources allowed. For many, burial in earth was the more practical option. But when the pyre blazed, it was unforgettable. There is also something undeniably theatrical about it. Imagine the flames towering into the night, the heat washing over the faces of the gathered mourners, the smell of resin and smoke filling the air. It was a performance as much as a ritual. And perhaps that was the point, sending a message not only to the gods, but to the community. Here lies someone worthy of fire. Interestingly, cremation wasn't always complete. Archaeologists have found burials where ashes were collected and placed in urns, sometimes mixed with soil, sometimes interred with other remains. In some cases, partial cremations occurred, just enough burning to signify transformation, before the remains were buried. Like much of Viking practice, it was flexible, adapting to circumstance and belief. And then there is the symbolism of fire itself. To the Vikings, flame was not only destructive but purifying. It cleansed, renewed, and connected heaven and earth. In mythology, fire played a role in both creation and destruction. Think of Ragnarok, the fiery end of the world. To burn a body was to tie death into this cosmic cycle, acknowledging that from destruction came new beginnings. Now, before this begins to sound too grim for bedtime, let's take comfort in the imagery. Imagine the flames, not as violent, but as gentle light against the dark. Picture sparks rising like stars, each carrying a fragment of memory upward. In that vision, there is something almost peaceful. And if this peaceful drift of fire and memory has carried you this far, perhaps this is a gentle moment to like the video. Subscribe to keep journeying with me, and leave a thought in the comments. Just as the Vikings left tokens for the afterlife, your small gestures help keep these tales alive in the present. Thus, Chapter 2 closes with the dual symbols of ship and fire, vessels of passage, tools of transformation, and reminders that the Vikings viewed death not as an end, but as a journey. And in the next chapter, we will step into the most unsettling part of these rituals, the grisly sacrifices that accompanied some funerals, and what they reveal about loyalty, fear, and the Viking vision of eternity. Death, in Viking culture, was not always a solitary affair. While some departed quietly, carried only by memory and symbol, others were accompanied, whether they wished it or not, by companions. And here lies one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking funerals, the practice of sacrifice. The most vivid account comes from Ahmed ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat who encountered the Rus, a people closely tied to Viking traders along the Volga River. What he witnessed was not the quiet dignity of a burial mound, nor the poetic drift of a burning ship. It was, instead, a ritual that blurred the line between farewell and horror. According to his writings, when a Viking chieftain died, his funeral stretched over days. Treasures were gathered, animals prepared, and a slave girl chosen to join him. In death, she was not forced outright, at least, not in public. Instead, she was offered drink after drink, reassured by those around her that the afterlife would be glorious, and that her master awaited her with open arms. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she had no choice but to say yes. Her final hours were filled with ritual. She was clothed in fine garments, paraded among the people, and led to visit the elders, who whispered words she was meant to carry into the next life. It was part blessing, part pressure, part theater. Then, on the day of the funeral, she was brought to the ship where her master's body lay, surrounded by offerings. There, as chants filled the air and drums beat steadily, she was killed, her life given to accompany his into eternity. Moments later, the pyre was lit, and flames consumed both bodies together. It is a scene both heartbreaking and terrifying, and yet, for the Vikings, it was also sacred. The sacrifice was believed to ensure that the dead would not be alone, that they would arrive in the afterlife with loyalty beside them. To the community, it was both a spiritual act and a display of devotion. Of course, not every Viking funeral included human sacrifice. Archaeology suggests it was relatively rare, reserved for people of high rank or extraordinary status. But the fact that it happened at all tells us much about how deeply the Vikings believed in the reality of the afterlife. They didn't just hope the soul continued, they acted as though it truly did. And they prepared accordingly, even if that meant blood. From our perspective today, it feels barbaric, even cruel. But if you set aside the horror for just a moment, you can glimpse something profoundly human underneath. The need to believe that no one journeys alone. The methods were brutal. but the intention was rooted in the same longing we carry, even now that death is not abandonment, but passage. And as unsettling as this may be, perhaps the sound of my voice softens the edges. Think of it less as a scene of terror, and more as a reminder of how far people will go to hold on to meaning, to promise companionship, to make sure the final voyage is not a lonely one. And if you've sailed this far with me through smoke and shadow, this might be a gentle moment to like the video, subscribe for more quiet wanderings through history, and share a thought in the comments. In their own way, the Vikings would have approved. They believed every offering mattered, no matter how small. Now, with the fire fading in our minds, and the sacrifice complete, let us step deeper into what these funerals really meant for the living, how they displayed power, cemented status, and turned grief into spectacle. When we hear of the sacrifice in Viking funerals, our first instinct is to recoil, and rightly so. The thought of a young woman, chosen to follow her master into death, unsettles our modern sensibilities. But to the Vikings, this act was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was rooted in a worldview where life and death were seamlessly intertwined, where loyalty extended beyond the grave, and where ritual carried weight greater than mere survival. The role of the sacrificed companion was both practical and symbolic. Practically, or occasionally he was meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife, just as in life. Symbolically, her presence proved the strength of the departed's household. A chief, so powerful that even in death he commanded attendance, was a chief worth honoring. Death, in this sense, was another stage upon which status was displayed. Ibn Fadlan's account emphasizes the ritualistic care given to the chosen girl. She was not discarded thoughtlessly. She was dressed, adorned, and intoxicated with drink. Her sacrifice was framed as an honor, though one suspects the honor was far more persuasive when accompanied by alcohol and peer pressure. Here lies one of history's quieter ironies. A practice that horrifies us today was once presented as a privilege. Humanity has always been very skilled at dressing violence in ceremony. Religion played its role as well. The Vikings believed in multiple afterlives. Valhalla for warriors, Folkvanger for others chosen by Freya, Hell for many ordinary souls. To send the dead well prepared was to ensure they would not wander lost. The sacrificed companion was a guarantee, an insurance policy that the departed would not face eternity alone. It was, in a strange way, a kindness by their standards, even if to us it feels unspeakably cruel. And so we find ourselves standing at the edge of a paradox. The Vikings lived in a world both brutal and beautiful, where devotion could mean life or death, and where rituals held communities together, even as they took individuals apart. It is uncomfortable, yes, but it also reminds us that human beings, across time, will do almost anything to make sense of mortality. If you're lying in bed now, eyes half closed, perhaps you can let the horror fade and keep only the rhythm of the story. Imagine the drums, the chants, the fire rising. Picture not the violence, but the solemnity, the way the community believed they were doing something necessary, something sacred. Sometimes, the lull of history comes not from comfort, but from seeing clearly how different, and yet how familiar, people once were. And as you drift between thought and sleep, this might be a gentle pause to like the video, subscribe for more quiet journeys into the past, and leave a thought in the comments. Consider it your own small ritual, not of sacrifice, but of connection. Now, having seen the sacrifice through the eyes of belief, let us step further to consider what it meant, not just for the dead, but for the living who stood watching, and the society that staged such rituals as grand theater. To understand Viking sacrifices fully, we must step away from the fire and look outward, toward the people who stood watching. Because a funeral was never just about the one who had died. It was a message to the entire community. Imagine yourself among the crowd. The drums beat, the air is thick with smoke, and before you stands a ship filled with treasures, animals, and the body of a leader. You watch as a young woman, prepared and adorned, is led to her fate. There is fear in the air, yes, but also, what you are witnessing is not simply death, it is a performance of power. For the family of the deceased, such a ritual said, "We are strong, we are wealthy, we honor our own with fire, blood, and loyalty that reaches beyond life itself." For rivals, it was a warning. For followers, it was reassurance that their leader commanded respect, even in death. The sacrifice became a spectacle that bound the living together, even as it sent the dead into the unknown. It is easy, from the safety of centuries later, to judge these acts as barbaric. And indeed, they were violent. But to the Vikings, violence was not the opposite of sacred, it was often its very expression. The spilling of blood, the giving of life, was understood as part of the cosmic order. In their mythology, even the gods themselves were bound by sacrifice and fate. Odin, after all, hung upon Yggdrasil, wounded by his own spear, to gain wisdom. To shed blood in ritual was not cruelty alone. It was participation in the cycles that shaped the universe. Still, it was theater. The funeral was staged as carefully as any play, with roles assigned, lines spoken, gestures rehearsed by generations of tradition. The mourners were the audience, the leaders were the directors, and the God-silent, invisible, were the ultimate judges. In that sense, Viking funerals were not so different from our own modern ceremonies. Public displays designed to comfort the living, impress the onlookers, and send a clear message about the one who had passed. But of course, not every funeral reached this level of spectacle. Most people died quietly, mourned by family, laid to rest with tokens of love rather than rivers of blood. The grand sacrifices, the great ships, the towering pyreses, were rare, reserved for moments when a community wanted to proclaim its strength to the world. And perhaps that is the true lesson. Even the most chilling rituals were, at their heart, about life, not the life of the dead, but the life of those who remained. They were acts of memory, of identity, of power. They were stories told with fire and sacrifice, meant to echo long after the smoke had cleared. So, as you listen now, with eyes heavy and thoughts drifting, let the harshness fade. Hear instead the murmur of a community gathered, the solemn chants, the crackle of flames. Imagine the ritual not as horror, but as a reminder that humans, in every age, have tried to turn loss into meaning, fear into ceremony, death into continuity. And if you've followed me this far into the shadows of Viking funerals, perhaps this is the moment to gently like the video. Subscribe for more hushed wanderings through the past, and share a thought in the comments. Just as the Vikings left offerings for their dead, your small gestures help keep this journey alive. With that, we leave behind the smoke of sacrifice and turn to another dimension of these funerals, how they reflected not just belief, but the raw display of power and status, how death became theater and grief became performance. In Viking society, a funeral was never only about saying farewell. It was also about making a statement, a final declaration of who the deceased had been, and who the survivors intended to be. For the powerful, this meant spectacle. A chieftain's funeral was not just a private goodbye, but a public stage. Every object placed in the grave, every animal sacrificed, every drumbeat and chant, each detail whispered, or perhaps shouted, this was a person of consequence. This family is strong. Their legacy endures. If you think about it, it's not so different from today. We might not pile horses into graves anymore, but lavish tombstones, grand mausoleums, or even the size of a modern funeral service still carry messages about wealth, respect, and influence. The Vikings simply made their statements with fire and blood, instead of polished granite and floral arrangements. What's particularly striking is how these funerals served the living as much as the dead. A grand send-off reminded everyone in the community of the deceased's importance, but it also reinforced the authority of those left behind. A son inheriting his father's chieftainship, for example, benefited immensely from a showy funeral. It was proof, in ritual form, that leadership and prestige had not died with the body they had passed on. Theatricality was essential. Vikings loved drama, and funerals gave them the chance to perform it on the largest stage imaginable. The funeral mound or pyre became a backdrop for displays of loyalty, wealth, and belief. The chants, sacrifices, and offerings weren't just rituals. They were choreography, and the audience friends, rivals, allies, strangers was meant to be impressed. One might say that Viking funerals were part memorial service, part political rally, and part mythological play. The gods were invoked, the ancestors honored, and the social order reaffirmed all in one fiery performance. Death, in this sense, was less an ending than a carefully scripted act in the ongoing story of the clan. Of course, not all funerals were extravagant. Ordinary people had simpler rites, often quiet and local, reflecting their station. But the very contrast reinforced the point. Grandeur was reserved for those who mattered most. It wasn't just that a chieftain received a ship burial. It was that everyone else didn't. The difference shouted louder than words, as you picture. These ceremonies, perhaps you can sense the rhythm of it, the flames, the chanting, the murmurs of awe in the crowd. And perhaps, as you sense that rhythm, you might also pause for a moment to like the video. Subscribe to keep journeying through history with me, and share your thoughts in the comments. Even in our quiet little corner here, your voice joins. The performance. Now, let us step further into this theater of death. For if funerals were plays, then the props were essential. Treasures, weapons, animals, even people, all chosen with care to tell the story of who the deceased had been. If a Viking funeral was a stage, then the grave goods were the props, arranged, not for the comfort of the dead alone, but for the eyes of the living. Each object had meaning, each placement told a story, and, like any good play, the set design mattered as much as the performance. Weapons were among the most common symbols of status. A warrior might be buried with his sword, his shield, or even his entire suit of armor. These were not merely tools of war, but signs of honor, reminders that he had lived bravely and would, in theory, fight eternally in Valhalla. Sometimes the weapons were bent or broken before burial, a symbolic act that released their spirit, allowing them to accompany their master. Practical, perhaps not, but theatrically satisfying. Absolutely. Animals, too, were chosen with care. Horses were the most prestigious, not just sacrificed for food, but sent into the afterlife as noble companions. A chieftain buried with a horse said to the world, "I rode with power, and I will ride again." Dogs were also common, symbols of loyalty that no doubt reassured mourners that the deceased would not wander alone. Chickens have been found in some burials as well, though whether they were companions, offerings, or simply dinner for the afterlife is a question archaeology has yet to answer with a straight face. And then, of course, there were human attendants. As we saw in the last chapter, these sacrifices rare, though they wielded an element of drama unlike any other. Nothing declared the importance of the deceased more loudly than the fact that another life was ended to join theirs. To us, this is chilling. To them, it was the ultimate prop, the final proof of status. Even everyday objects carried weight. Tools, cooking pots, combs, jewelry, these weren't just random items. They represented continuity, a way of saying, this person mattered in life, and they will matter in death. A comb might seem mundane, but it also said, "Yes, even in Valhalla, I will keep my beard neat." All of this served the community as much as the deceased. A wealthy funeral reassured people that their leader's household was still powerful. A well-stocked grave reminded allies of prosperity, and warned rivals not to underestimate the survivors. Funerals, in this sense, were less about grief and more about continuity, about making sure life carried on with the proper order intact. And, if you think about it, we're not so different. Today, lavish memorials, elaborate tombs, or even extravagant obituary announcements play the same role. They tell a story about who mattered and how much. The props have changed, but the performance is ongoing. So as you lie here, letting the image of a burial ship filled with goods drift across your imagination, perhaps you might gently pause to like the video. Subscribe for more journeys into the past, and leave a thought in the comments. Your words too are a kind of offering, tokens left behind to keep the story alive now. Let us step into the crowd itself, the mourners, the family, the community, for it was not just the objects or the rituals, but the collective presence of the living that turned a Viking funeral into something unforgettable. If the ships, the fire, and the treasures were the stage, then the community was the audience and, sometimes, the cast itself. A Viking funeral wasn't something private, whispered in hushed tones. It was an event, a gathering, that pulled people together in solemnity, in awe, and in spectacle. For the family, the funeral was a chance to reaffirm their place in society. Neighbors, allies, rivals, all were invited, and all were meant to witness. The show, a well-attended funeral, spoke volumes. This person was respected. This family commands loyalty. A poorly attended one, well, that sent a different message entirely. The rituals themselves were communal acts. Songs were sung not by one, but by many. The chanting of prayers, the steady rhythm of drums, the raising of torches each moment, wove the community into the fabric of the ceremony. Even the act of watching mattered. To stand at the edge of the funeral pyre was to participate, to be part of the story being told. And what a story it was. The funeral of a chieftain could last days, filled with processions, sacrifices, and feasts. Food and drink were shared generously, ensuring that even grief came with a measure of celebration. After all, death was not just loss, it was also continuity. The reminder that life went on, that bonds of kinship and loyalty still held. For ordinary people, funerals were simpler. A grave dug into the earth, perhaps a small mound, a few goods, and words spoken in remembrance. These, too, carried meaning, though without the grand spectacle of wealth and power. But even in their simplicity, they bound families and neighbors together, reinforcing the shared rhythms of life and death. The difference between the grand and the modest was deliberate. It reinforced the social order, reminding everyone of where they stood. The chieftain's funeral was theater on a grand stage, while the farmer's was a quiet fireside tale. Both were stories, but one echoed across generations, while the other lingered only in memory. And perhaps this is what makes Viking funerals so fascinating. They were never just about the dead. They were about the living, about unity, hierarchy, and the human need to turn grief into something larger than silence. So, as you rest now, letting the image of a great crowd gathered around a glowing pyre drift in your thoughts, perhaps this is the moment to gently like the video. Subscribe for more quiet wanderings through history, and leave a thought in the comments. Just as the Vikings gathered to keep memory alive, your presence here helps these stories sail a little further into the night. With that, we leave behind the theater of power and step into the echoes that remain, the ways Viking funerals have shaped myth, legend, and the traces they've left in earth and story alike. Long after the flames of the last Viking pyres died out, their funerals continued to echo through soil, through stone, and through story. What the Vikings left behind was not only ash and bone, but also clues scattered across landscapes and sagas, waiting for us to piece together. Take, for example, the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. Discovered in 1904, inside, archaeologists found two women laid to rest in a vessel nearly 70 feet long, adorned with ornate carvings that curled like dragon heads along the prow. The grave was overflowing with objects: carved wooden slaves, woven tapestries, tools, kitchen utensils, and even the remains of animals. It was as though an entire household had been carefully packed away for use in the afterlife. Scholars still debate the identities of the women, perhaps a queen and her servant, or two high-ranking priestesses. Whoever they were, their burial was not just interment. It was performance, meant to endure through centuries. And endure it did. Then there is the Gokstad ship, also in Norway, where a chieftain was buried with an astonishing array of goods: dogs, horses, peacocks, yes, peacocks, which had been imported from faraway lands. Apparently, even in death, he wanted to flaunt that his connections went beyond Scandinavia. One might say he was showing off at his own funeral, which is quite a feat. Across the North Sea, at Sutton, who in England, a burial site revealed another ship interred with treasure helmets, weapons, and Byzantine silverware. Though not strictly Viking, it belonged to Anglo-Saxon royalty. The similarity is striking. It tells us that the idea of the ship as a vessel for the afterlife resonated across cultures, perhaps whispering of shared mythologies and long voyages of exchange. And here lies the beautiful intersection between archaeology and mythology. In the Norse sagas, we hear of grand funerals where heroes were laid in ships, sent forth with treasures, and lifted to the halls of the gods. Archaeology grounds these stories, showing us that they were not mere fantasy, but practices rooted in reality. Yet at the same time, the sagas exaggerate, romanticize, and add the flair of drama. The truth is somewhere in between. Real rituals wrapped in layers of myth. Hollywood, of course, chose the myth. The image of a flaming ship drifting into the horizon survives not because it is accurate, but because it is poetic. Archaeologists sigh, historians groan, but audiences love it. And perhaps the Vikings themselves would have smiled knowingly, for they too understood that sometimes the story mattered more than the fact. After all, what is a funeral if not the telling of one final tale? So when we uncover these ship burials and pore over sagas, we are not just studying death, we are watching the Vikings write their own legend into both earth and memory. And while the details differ, the echoes remain clear. Ships, fire, treasures, and the ever-present desire to make the end feel like a beginning. If archaeology gives us bones and ships, modern culture gives us smoke and spectacle. Over the centuries, the image of the Viking funeral has been reshaped, retold, and let's be honest, romanticized into something quite different from the original. Take Hollywood, for instance. The flaming longship sailing into the horizon has become the quintessential Viking farewell, appearing in countless movies and television shows. It is a beautiful picture, the fire reflecting on the water, the ship shrinking into the distance, the sense of a life ending with grandeur. The only problem: there's no solid archaeological evidence that it ever actually happened. But history is rarely allowed to spoil a good cinematic moment. The sagas themselves are partly to blame. Written centuries after the Viking Age, they blended memory with myth, transforming funerals into grand stories worthy of heroes. A simple burial mound was not enough for a saga writer. No, the hero had to be launched in fire, surrounded by treasure, watched by gods. And over time, these legends hardened into what we now think of as tradition. Modern reenactments follow this same romantic thread. In some parts of Scandinavia and, occasionally elsewhere, you'll see symbolic Viking-style funerals, staged for commemorations or festivals. A wooden boat, often smaller than the grand ships of old, is set aflame and sent drifting into the water. It is, in truth, more theater than archaeology. But it captures the spirit of what we want Viking: death to be bold, dramatic, unforgettable. There is, of course, something charming about our insistence on keeping this image alive. Even if inaccurate, it speaks to a deep fascination with the Vikings as larger-than-life figures. We don't just want them to raid and conquer, we want them to die spectacularly too. History may whisper that most were buried quietly in the ground, but our imaginations prefer the roar of fire on the waves. And maybe that's all right. After all, the Vikings themselves staged their funerals as theater, with drums, chants, and flames. If we continue the performance today in our own ways, perhaps we're not betraying their memory, but honoring it just with a bit of modern flair. So, as you listen and drift, think of how stories evolve, how rituals become legends, and how legends become films that we half believe. It is all part of the same process. Humans searching for meaning in death, and refusing to let silence have the last word. And if this gentle reflection has carried you along, perhaps this is the moment to quietly like the video, subscribe for more softly told stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your presence here is part of the performance, another echo in the long chain of retelling. Now, let us turn to the final part of this chapter. The lasting lessons Viking funerals leave us not just in myth or archaeology, but in the way they reveal something eternal about humanity itself. As the sagas fade and the smoke drifts away, we are left with a question: what do Viking funerals truly teach us? Not just about them, but about ourselves. The first lesson is that death has always been a stage for meaning. Whether through ships buried beneath earth, flames reaching toward the sky, or sacrifices made in trembling devotion, the Vikings sought to turn an ending into a story. We do the same today, though in gentler ways. Eulogies, memorials, flowers carefully placed on gravestones. The scale differs, the symbols change, but the need remains. We want to believe death is not silence, but continuation. The second lesson is that ritual is theater. A Viking chieftain's funeral was part religious act, part political statement, part community performance. The living gathered, watched, remembered and learned who still held power when the smoke cleared. Today, our rituals may be quieter, but they too are staged. We speak words meant to comfort, wear clothes meant to respect, gather in places meant to symbolize. We perform, not to deceive, but to anchor ourselves in meaning. And the third lesson: humans, across time, prefer beauty over accuracy. The truth is that most Viking funerals were simple: bodies buried in graves, goods placed carefully, loved ones grieving quietly. Yet what we remember and what we retell are the flaming ships, the grand sacrifices, the fire that lit the night. History gives us bones, but imagination gives us legend. And often, it is legend that survives. There is something strangely soothing in this. To know that even in their darkest rituals, the Vikings were reaching for the same thing we do: connection, continuity, remembrance. They may have used fire and blood, where we use flowers and songs, but the heart of it is familiar. So as you rest now, let that familiarity cradle you. Picture the echoes of fire fading into the stars, the ships sailing quietly beneath mounds of earth, the sagas whispering through time. Viking funerals may be strange, even unsettling, but in their strangeness, they remind us how deeply human the search for meaning truly is. And if this closing reflection has brought you calm, this is a gentle time to like the video, subscribe for more softly told histories, and share a thought in the comments. In doing so, you become part of the channel, another voice carrying the story onward. With that, our voyage through the strange funerals of the Vikings comes to an end. But as all endings do, it points toward another beginning, another tale, waiting just beyond the horizon. And so, we close the lid on the longship, so to speak. Over these 5 chapters, we've wandered through smoke and song, through fire and soil, through rituals both solemn and strange. We began by peeling back the myths, discovering that the cinematic Viking funeral, the flaming ship drifting into the sea, was more legend than fact. We saw how ships and fire symbolized journeys, how treasures and animals were packed carefully for eternity, and how, sometimes, blood was spilled in sacrifice. We watched as funerals became stages for power, where grief was mixed with theater, where the dead were honored but the living made their statements. And finally, we listened to the echoes that remain archaeology sagas, and the modern imagination that refuses to let Vikings die quietly. What lingers, I think, is not the violence or the spectacle, but the humanity. The Vikings, for all their strangeness, were reaching for the same comfort we all seek. That death is not the end, but a passage. They dressed it in flames, drums, and sometimes a bit too much blood. But beneath it all was love, memory, and continuity. And maybe that is the gentle irony of history, that across centuries, across cultures, we all stage our farewells, trying to make silence a little less silent. If this voyage through Viking funerals has soothed your mind or sparked a quiet curiosity, I invite you to like the video, subscribe for more midnight wanderings into the odd corners of history, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your presence here helps the tale sail a little farther. Next time, we'll open another door in history, perhaps, to a ritual even stranger, or a daily life more curious than we expect. For the past is never boring. It only waits for us to listen, so, until then, rest well, dream gently, and may your longship sail quietly into the night.